Welcome to the Environmental Justice Lab. I am your host, Dr. Leslie Joseph. Thank you so much for joining me. We are in our series of episodes on sacrifice zones, and within that, we are still in our sub-series on Cancer Alley specifically. And on this episode, I want to talk about the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. I want to discuss their involvement in Cancer Alley, specifically what they've done recently and what they're trying to do to address the discriminatory, disproportionate air pollution and environmental burden that residents in Cancer Alley have had to deal with for so long. We're going to talk about these things, talk about their complaints to the EPA and what the EPA has done in response, because the EPA is ultimately responsible for ensuring that the residents in Cancer Alley are safe and protected from these toxic, disproportionate levels of air pollution and all of the environmental hazards that are associated with the factories and the plants that are located in Cancer Alley. So what is the EPA doing and how are they addressing these issues and concerns? That is what we're discussing on this episode. Stay tuned. This is the Environmental Justice Lab. Welcome to the Environmental Justice Lab. I'm Dr. Joseph. Thank you for listening. So we are talking about the EPA's involvement in Cancer Alley, and I want to spend this episode discussing what the EPA is doing to address the concerns of the residents in Cancer Alley. Now, if you remember, a few episodes ago, we started our sub-series on Cancer Alley by talking about the lawsuit that the EPA filed against the Dinka plant. It was a big move by the EPA. And it was that action that prompted me to begin this sub-series on Cancer Alley. It really set the stage for what we understand about Cancer Alley and how we've been discussing it on the podcast. And so I would encourage you all to go back and listen to that episode. It was a good one. But there were things that happened way before that lawsuit was filed that are important to highlight, particularly with the EPA. And so let's just start from the beginning. So back in 2021, the newly appointed EPA administrator, his name is Michael Regan. He went on what he would call his Journey to Justice tour. He went through Mississippi, he went through Louisiana, he went through Texas, and the goal was to, quote, spotlight long-standing environmental justice concerns in historically marginalized communities and hear firsthand from residents dealing with the impacts of pollution. That was the goal of the tour. And so the idea was he was going to go and travel, hear the stories, hear feedback from marginalized communities that are dealing with heavy burdens of pollution and craft policy and help expedite ways to address those concerns. And look, I'm sure a lot of it was genuinely listening and trying to understand and getting the full weight of the issues that were surrounding these communities. But let's be honest, a bigger part of that tour was to promote the recent bills that were passed by the new administration, right? So infrastructure bills, the Build Back Better plan, the Justice 40 initiative. The idea was he was going to go to these communities and reassure them that the laws and the policies that were being put forth would help them directly with the issues that they were dealing with in real time. And so that was a large part of this tour. He hears from them, but then they also hear from him as to what the EPA is doing and what the president is doing, the Department of Justice is doing, and that was a large part of what this tour was meant to be about. And this is why I love community groups, activists, and advocates, because, they let him come through. He listened. He heard what they were saying. They heard what he was saying, and they were excited that he came, but they didn't shrink back, and they didn't allow his, office and his position to deter them from what they were trying to accomplish, which was justice in their neighborhoods and their communities. They called for accountability, and they called for action to deal with the pollution and to deal with the environmental racism that's been going on for way too long. And ultimately, they called for a reduction in the pollution. Because it's not as though anybody wants more people to experience it we don't want anyone having to live with such high levels of air pollution and such poisonous environments. So they weren't trying to get more money. They weren't trying to get more attention to their neighborhoods. They weren't trying to position themselves to be anything in particular in society. The idea was we just need some action. We need somebody to come in and legislate and have policies in place that protect us from these hazards. So I'm sure the administrator heard this and he said, we're going to make sure that the bad actors are held accountable, and we're going to make sure that no community is mistreated in the ways that you've been. And he made declarations as to what actions were going to be done to address these issues. And so the residents said, great, here are some formal complaints for you to consider and investigate so we can get this ball rolling and get these things put into place. And so within 6 months of his Journey to Justice tour, the EPA got 3 Title VI complaints that were filed with the External Office of Civil Rights from residents in Cancer Alley. In case you're unaware, Title VI of the Civil Rights Act prohibits recipients of federal financial assistance from discriminating based on race, color, or national origin in any program or activity. So for instance, let's just say you have a state agency. We'll call it the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality. If they receive funds from the EPA to run a clean air program to ensure that the air is clean and to minimize pollution, then that state recipient, the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality, is legally prohibited from discriminating on the basis of race, color, or national origin under Title VI when they engage in their enforcement activities. Activities like air permitting or citing polluting facilities. And so it didn't take long for these residents to take up the EPA on their declaration to hold people accountable. And they filed these Title VI complaints under the Civil Rights Act. And so there were 3 very specific ones that they filed that they wanted a response from the EPA on. The first one was filed by Earth Justice and the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights on behalf of the concerned citizens of St. John Parish and the Sierra Club. And so this complaint said that the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality subjected residents to discrimination based on race when they implemented their air pollution control program. So what they're saying is, in particular, there is the Dinka plant, which is in the St. John the Baptist Parish, and that plant exposes the residents of that parish to disproportionately high levels of air pollution, including chloroprene. If you remember the episode on the EPA's lawsuit, you'll learn more about chloroprene and how damaging it is. And because St. John is predominantly African American, the complaint says you're discriminating based on race by the way you've allowed this plant to pollute in this predominantly black area. That's the first complaint. There's another complaint where they're saying that the Louisiana Department of Health discriminates on the basis of race by not providing the black residents in that parish the right information about the threats to their health that are imposed by this plant, this Dinka plant that's emitting air pollution in their community. They didn't provide necessary recommendations on how to prevent exposure, how to reduce your exposure to this pollution, and they don't get good health information on how to protect themselves in the event that they get exposed to this pollution. And they're saying that it's on the basis of race that they're not getting that information, because in other communities across the state, that information is provided even when there's less pollution to be concerned about. And that's the second complaint. So we got the first 2 complaints about this Dinka plant in St. John the Baptist Parish, one against the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality, which is the regulators there, and then the second one on the Louisiana Department of Health, which is the health department in the state. And the third complaint was filed by the Tulane Environmental Law Clinic on behalf of several different groups in the area. Groups like Rise St. James, like the Louisiana Bucket Brigade, Stop the Wallace Grain Terminal. And this complaint says that the Louisiana Department of Environmental Quality discriminated on the basis of race by allowing this Formosa facility to get several new permits to release harmful, toxic chemicals in the St. James Parish in a discriminatory fashion. They're citing pollutants like PM 2.5, nitrogen dioxide, carbon monoxide, benzene, formaldehyde. All of these toxic air pollutants could come from this large Formosa plant, and the state agency is not doing anything about it. They're allowing it to move forward. They've reaffirmed the permits for this facility, and they're just going ahead moving forward without any regard for the residents there, to the point where the complaint says that the residents weren't even involved in a discussion related to those permitting decisions. And so that's the third complaint. So basically, these complaints deal with the fact that the state regulators are running their air permitting programs in a discriminatory fashion, and that the Department of Health is not warning people about the issues associated with these potential pollutants that they're going to be exposed to. And they call out specifically the Dinka plant and the Formosa plant. That's going to be really important to remember later on in this episode. Dinka and Formosa. And so what does the EPA do about these complaints? They got the complaints. So they did the tour. They heard from the residents. The residents responded with these complaints to their office. What did the EPA do? So let's give them some credit. The EPA investigated these complaints, looked into them, and they issued what they called a letter of concern to the state regulators and the Department of Health. And in that letter, they listed out what they found in their investigation, and they outlined their concerns to these agencies. The idea being that they're going to show they're concerned, they see the issues that were brought to them, they're real issues, and that they should respond to them. In the letter, the EPA basically just restated what the complaint said about the issues in these communities. It says things like the EPA has significant concerns that Black residents and children living near the Dinka plant have been subjected to discrimination through the department's inaction. They knew that. That's what they've been saying. But this letter from the EPA basically reaffirms that reality and highlights how important it is that the state of Louisiana does something about this. And they even offer their recommendations, right? They have things like, you need to have more community meetings, more public input. You need to do some cumulative impact assessments and analysis instead of looking at one facility individually. Look at the cumulative effect of all of them together. You need more air monitoring. You need more data collection around the communities and the facility. A bunch of things they've been asking for all along anyway. This letter of concern says to the state, hey, do something about these things. These are real problems. And in a perfect world, the state regulators, the State Department of Health, would get the letter and they would say, oh, the EPA agrees with the residents. They all agree that these are issues. We should do something about it. Let's fix it, or at least work towards a solution. But of course, that's not what happened. They didn't do anything about any of these complaints. I think they sent a letter back highlighting what they have done in the past and how they haven't broken any of the laws and how they've been in consistent adherence to the regulations. Things that aren't really going to change anything and that don't really answer the concerns that were addressed and that were highlighted for them. But it's okay. That's how the state responded. And so the big thing now is what has happened since then. This letter went out. What has been done in Cancer Alley as a result of the Journey to Justice tour, these complaints, and then this letter of concern? What action has taken place? So the big thing that's happened since this letter went out is the lawsuit that EPA filed against Dinka and DuPont to reduce their emissions. A few episodes back, you'll see what I thought about it. Just know it was a big move from the EPA. It was a big move. I didn't even know they could do that. I did not know the EPA could actually sue a facility and sue a company. But they did that. And what's interesting, after doing some more research, the EPA actually sent a letter to the CEOs of Dinka and DuPont asking them to consider the community and to reduce their emissions before they sent the lawsuit. And I get it, a letter is not very forceful in a lot of ways, but there was communication that something should be done in this area, and that was from the EPA to the CEOs. They didn't respond, didn't do anything to address it, and so then the lawsuit came. So that's good news. It's a real step, it's real action that was taken on behalf of those residents in Cancer Alley. And another positive development is that the EPA forced the Dinka plant to install more air monitors on its property, and the EPA is installing more air monitors throughout the neighboring communities. So now there's more data, there's more understanding of the severity of the pollution, and we can get more information about what is or isn't happening in those areas. And so that's a positive development that will pay off in the long run once that data gets collected and is analyzed and discussed among the residents and among the individuals who are running the facility and those companies in general. And last September, even before the complaints were filed, a federal judge in Louisiana vacated those permits for the Formosa plant. So if you remember, those complaints were about Dinka and Formosa, but a federal judge threw those permits out for the Formosa plant, which, by the way, was going to be the biggest plant of its kind in the country. This was going to be a huge plant. Let me just give you the quick rundown really quickly about this plant. So this plant was going to be $9.4 billion with a B. That's how much it was going to cost to build this huge facility. And it was reported by Reuters that if they approved and built this plant, it would be one of the world's largest facilities for producing plastics and plastic materials. And ProPublica reported that this facility would more than triple the level of cancer-causing pollution throughout the parish. That's how catastrophic it would have been if this plant got built in this area. And so it is a great thing that a judge looked at Cancer Alley and said, no, you can't build that here. And so they killed that project. It is not going forward. I'm sure they're trying to get it revived again, but it's not going forward. And so that is something very positive. It didn't come from the EPA. It didn't come from the state. It came from a federal judge in Louisiana after complaints were brought by the residents. As far as I can tell, the state hasn't made any attempts to deal with the air pollution in this area. They're the ones who approved the plant to begin with. They've approved all these plants to come and build and pollute in Cancer Alley, and they keep allowing them to come. They justified the Formosa plant by saying that it would bring over 1,000 jobs to the area and that it would be a huge economic driver in the state. And that's why we should allow this facility to come, this big $9.4 billion monstrosity to come to this area, because there could be some economic benefit, which we know wouldn't benefit the people living there, just others from outside of those communities. And, it's easy to see why the state wouldn't do anything about any of these issues, because first of all, if they did, they'd have to admit that they were wrong in allowing those facilities to come to the area. I mean, think about it. You have to actually go up and say, I think we made a mistake in allowing these plants to build. So we need to reduce the pollution. We need to shut down these plants. We need to do something different to protect the residents. We made a bad decision. I don't think they would want to do that. And to be honest, I think the bigger reason is that we just have to be honest about the fact that environmental racism is alive and well. It's alive and well. The more color you have in your skin, the less protection you get from your government and your regulators, particularly when there's money involved. It's just the truth. And when it comes down to it, there are some areas, there are some people that the state, that organizations and companies and industries believe can be sacrificed. They can be sacrificed for what they would consider to be something that's more important. We can get more jobs, bring in more revenue, more money to the state. We can have more industry, more activity. Let's bring it here, and we will sacrifice those who are in the way or those who are not as valuable as others. It's really unfortunate, but it's why we keep fighting. It's why this podcast exists, to talk about these issues. And so the state's not going to do anything to help. The EPA is doing what they can. They're suing. They are increasing air monitoring, and they're working. But let's just make sure we understand that the real change and the real advances are going to come from the grassroots. And so even more recently, I think about a week ago, the residents in Cancer Alley took matters into their own hands. And so the residents in St. James Parish sued the St. James Parish Planning Commission and the St. James Parish Council. And in that lawsuit, they are seeking a moratorium on chemical plants in the St. James Parish. They're saying we don't want any more facilities whatsoever in our community. And I absolutely love this action. This is what it takes. This is what needs to happen. You keep fighting. You keep using whatever tools you have at your disposal to keep the polluters and the pollution out of your community. This is how change takes place. And so when you think about this whole discussion, it should bring hope. These activities should bring hope to the people who live in Cancer Alley. And it should give hope to anyone who is fighting environmental racism wherever you are, no matter who you are or what the issue is. This kind of thing gives me hope, right? To know that the EPA, at least for now, the EPA is willing to take some action against these polluters, right? They sued Dinka and DuPont. They're putting up monitors. They're doing something. And then to know that there are community groups and activists who are not sitting down while their communities are being polluted and sacrificed. They're actually getting up and they are taking action, and those actions are having an impact. Think about that. So a federal court vacated the permits of the biggest plastic plant in the country. It just shows that real change is possible and that the legacy of Cancer Alley doesn't have to remain a legacy of environmental degradation and destruction and racism and injustice. Because Cancer Alley is known worldwide. It's almost like a case study. It's like a textbook example of environmental racism. But that can be changed. People stepping up, groups from the grassroots coming up and demanding things be different can change the way people look at this area and can change the trajectory of the lives of the people that live there. It's amazing to think about the possibilities when you see these kinds of actions and advances taking place and people recognizing what's truly happening in these areas. And if you're listening from outside the United States, if you're in a different country and you're thinking, well, you know what, we don't have an EPA to regulate pollution for us. We don't have an agency that we can petition to come and investigate our situations. We don't have the kind of court system that we can appeal to. We don't have these mechanisms where we are to get these things done like you do in the United States. And I hear you. We can't assume that everybody has these resources. But what I can say is that no matter who you are or where you are, true, lasting, sustainable change comes from the ground up. It always has. Don't look at the United States and think that the EPA is this benevolent agency that has come to help and save you from the degradation you're experiencing. That's not what happened. Don't think that the court system and the federal judges looked at Cancer Alley and said, oh no, I cannot stand by while this happens to you. That's not what happened. These grassroots organizations rose up and they demanded that things be different. And they looked around and they saw what was available to them as far as resources and tools go, and they leveraged them for that change. And they continue now to raise their voice and to continue to push and push and push for things to be different and for things to be better. And that can be done anywhere. It can be done at any moment because the people hold the power. The people are the ones who determine what their lives are going to ultimately be about and how they're going to be governed. Because if you don't like how things are going, if you don't like what you see, you can demand for things to be different, and there's strength in numbers. So organize, you mobilize, you take action. If it's petitions, if it's marches and protests, if it's boycotts, if it's sit-ins, if it's whatever it takes to bring attention to your issue, and whatever it takes to get whoever is in power to pay attention to what's happening on the ground where you are, you do that. You take those actions, you take those steps. And I promise you, there is an international community. We're all out here. We're cheering for you. We're rooting for you. We want you to live in a world free from this life of pollution, of sickness, of death, of disease. We want everyone to thrive, to be happy, to be whole, to be healthy, and we continue to fight toward that end. So in Cancer Alley, we can see, because it's on front pages of papers and on the websites, we see what they're doing and how they're calling for change and demanding things to be different. And that can be encouraging and inspiring for the rest of us, wherever we live, to fight for the same thing. So keep fighting. We are all here with you as you do so. And thanks for listening to this episode. Before I go, though, I want to say thank you to everybody listening, everyone who supported the podcast, everyone who has reached out to me on Instagram, wherever you have, and just said what you thought about it. I appreciate your comments. It really does encourage me to continue this work when I hear positive feedback and negative feedback too. Either feedback is fine, because this is for all of us here to think about how we can continue to advance environmental justice around the world. And so thank you to all of you listening. And a special shout out to Connie V. She says she is fighting for environmental justice in Los Angeles. Keep fighting, Connie. Again, thank you all for listening. This is the Environmental Justice Lab, where we are for the people and for the planet. See you next time.